Hello, dear listeners. Today you will hear a story about how a sniper's past literally haunted him, leading a global terror network. By the way, write in the comments which city you are from. We're very curious to know. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. The crosshairs settled, a breath held, a life extinguished. Or so I thought. Even now, years later, the echo of that single shot reverberated in the quiet solitude of John Miller's cabin, a constant, unwelcome companion. He woke before the sun, as always. The habit, ingrained deeper than bone, was a relic from another life, a life lived in shadows and the stark clarity of a scope. The smell of pine and damp earth was a poor substitute for the dust and diesel of Kandahar, but it was his sanctuary, his prison. He moved with a practiced economy, a quiet ballet of movement honed by years of not being seen, not being heard. The M24 SWS, disassembled and meticulously cleaned, lay in its case under the floorboards, a silent testament to a past he tried and failed to outrun. He made coffee, strong and black, the bitterness a familiar comfort against the lingering dreams. Dreams that were never quite dreams, more like replays, vivid and unforgiving. John Miller, ghost to those who knew him then, was a handyman now, a man who fixed leaky pipes and mended broken fences for the scattering of folks in this remote corner of Montana. They saw a quiet, capable man with eyes that held too much distance, but they asked no questions. He preferred it that way. Small talk was a minefield, each innocent query a potential trigger. A sudden clap of thunder could send him scrambling for cover, the sound too close to distant artillery, the scent of burning trash, a fleeting whiff of something acrid and metallic could transport him back to the acrid haze of a bombed-out village. He'd learned to compartmentalize, to build walls within himself, but the foundations were always shifting. He remembered a conversation with his spotter, Mac, during a particularly grueling deployment. Mac had been talking about coming home, about his wife and kids. "You think it ever really leaves you, John?" Mac had asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. John hadn't answered then, and he still didn't have a good one. He just knew it hadn't left him, not a single day. The memory of the Kandahar kill was the heaviest, not just the act, but the face. A young man, barely out of his teens, caught in the crosshairs. Intel said he was a rising leader, orchestrating attacks, a threat. John had pulled the trigger, believing he was saving lives, preventing future bloodshed. The clean shot, the immediate fall. He'd confirmed the kill, packed up, and moved on. But the image, the brief, stark moment of life becoming absence, had etched itself onto his soul. He'd seen plenty of death, inflicted plenty. But that one had stuck. It wasn't the brutality that haunted him, but the quiet finality of it, the cold calculation. He had been a tool, precise and effective. But what was the cost of that precision? What was the cost of playing God, even for a righteous cause? He'd tried therapy, a few sessions mandated by the VA. A well-meaning woman with kind eyes and a clipboard, asking about his feelings. He'd given her the sanitized version, the one they wanted to hear. The truth was too messy, too dark, too much for a civilian to understand. How do you explain the weight of a life, taken with such deliberate care? How do you articulate the hollow victory of preventing an attack that would never be, because you had already intervened? He'd found a different kind of therapy in the solitude of the mountains, the rhythm of physical labor, chopping wood, mending fences, the tangible results a balm to a mind that often felt adrift in a sea of what-ifs. He could feel the splintered wood in his hands, the ache in his muscles, proof that he was still here, still alive. But even the quiet beauty of the desolate landscape couldn't fully drown out the internal static. He'd often sit on his porch, watching the deer graze in the early morning mist, the silence profound. But in that silence, he could still hear the faint, almost imperceptible hum of his own hyper-vigilance, a low thrum beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. Every rustle in the leaves, every distant bird call was processed, analyzed, dismissed. A habit that had saved his life countless times, now simply an exhausting background process. He'd tried to live, to simply exist, but the quiet hum of his past was a constant low-frequency vibration against the fragile peace he had built. He thought of Mac again, and the last time they'd spoken, years after their deployments. Mac had seemed lighter. He'd found peace, or something close to it, in his family. John envied him that. His own family was a distant memory, a casualty of his choices, his deployments. He had chosen the path of solitude, believing it was the only way to protect those he might inadvertently harm with his own fractured psyche. He poured himself another cup of coffee, the steam rising in the cool morning air. The sun was just beginning to touch the highest peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful, indifferent world. He picked up a worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, a book given to him by a chaplain years ago. He rarely read it, but the weight of it in his hands was a comfort. The words were about control, about finding peace within oneself, about accepting what cannot be changed. He was still trying to learn those lessons. He glanced at the small, crackling television in the corner, a relic he kept more for background noise than actual viewing. Local news mostly about crop yields and upcoming town meetings. But then, the anchor's voice shifted, the tone more serious, the background graphics suddenly stark. A global terrorism update. He wasn't paying full attention, not really. Just the usual reports of unrest, of emerging threats, the endless cycle of violence that had defined so much of his life. He took a sip of his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. The anchor continued, detailing the rise of a new, highly coordinated network, responsible for a series of increasingly sophisticated attacks. They called their leader the Architect, a name that sent a chill down his spine, a name that felt too familiar, too deliberate. The news report flickered, a grainy image appearing on the screen. A face, not quite clear, but unmistakable. The eyes, the set of the jaw. The world saw a terrorist. John Miller saw the face of a man he'd once believed he'd saved it from. A ghost from a past war promising to shatter the fragile peace he had built. His hand, which had been reaching for the remote, froze in midair. The coffee cup, forgotten, slowly cooled in his grasp. The quiet hum of his hyper-vigilance intensified, no longer a background process, but a piercing alarm. The solitude of his cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a cage. The mountains, once a source of peace, now seemed to mock his attempts at escape. He had buried that ghost, he thought. He had buried it deep, under layers of time and distance, under the weight of his own guilt and the hope for a different future. But ghosts, he knew, had a way of returning, especially the ones you thought you'd laid to rest yourself. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the pine trees. The world outside continued its indifferent dance. But for John Miller, the dance had just begun again, a macabre waltz with a specter from his past. The fragile peace was shattered, irrevocably. The hunt, it seemed, was back on. The intel was clear, chillingly so. He was back. The ghost I'd buried. The static on the secure line crackled. A familiar sound that used to precede orders. Now it just heralded disruption. Agent Davies, his voice a low rumble, didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Miller, we have a problem. Your Kandahar target, he's alive." The words hit John like a physical blow, a phantom punch to the gut. Alive? For years that kill had been a cornerstone of his fractured peace, the one undeniable victory in a landscape of moral compromises. He'd seen the body, or what was left of it. He'd filed the report. The intelligence had been solid. Or so he thought. Davies continued, oblivious to the earthquake he'd just unleashed in John's mind. "New intelligence, confirmed through multiple channels. He's operating under a new alias, the Serpent. He's built a network, global in scope, far more sophisticated than anything he had in Kandahar. We're talking coordinated attacks, high-level recruitment, and his signature, it's unmistakable." John's hand tightened around the phone, knuckles white. The Serpent. A new name, but the same venom. He could feel the cold sweat prickling his hairline. The room, his sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage, the walls closing in. He remembered the dust, the heat, the way the light had played on the scope that day. The target, younger then, defiant even in the crosshairs. He'd squeezed the trigger, a clean shot. A life ended. Or so he'd believed. Was it possible to be so wrong, to carry that weight, that burden of a kill, only for it to be resurrected, more potent, more dangerous than before? The thought was a bitter bile in his throat. He'd spent years trying to reconcile that moment, to justify the taking of a life, to understand the necessity. Now, it was all for naught. The ghost he'd buried had clawed its way back, not as a memory, but as a living, breathing threat. Davy's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. He's behind the recent attacks in London, Paris, and that attempted cyber strike on NATO infrastructure last month. This isn't some backwater insurgency anymore, Miller. This is organized, state-level terrorism. And he's at the helm. John closed his eyes, the image of the young man in the scope superimposed over the faces of the innocent victims, flashed across the news reports he'd dismissed as background noise. The world saw a terrorist. He saw the face of a man he'd once believed he'd saved it from. The moral ambiguity of his past actions, always a dull ache, now pulsed with searing pain. He'd been so certain. The intelligence brief on the original target, a mid-level insurgent commander, had painted a clear picture, a threat to coalition forces, a recruiter of child soldiers, a purveyor of violence. But in the scope, he hadn't seen a monster, just a man. A man with a scar above his left eye, a slight tremor in his hand as he spoke to his subordinates. Details that had haunted him, humanizing the target in a way that combat manuals never prepared you for. He'd suppressed those details, compartmentalized them, filed them away under necessary evils. Now they were back, demanding to be seen. He felt a tremor in his own hands now, a familiar precursor to the flashbacks that were already beginning to build. The scent of cordite, the taste of dust, the distant cries of a village. His quiet life, the one he'd painstakingly constructed brick by fragile brick, was crumbling around him. The silence on the line stretched, heavy with unspoken questions. Davies, sensing John's internal battle, offered a lifeline, or perhaps a noose. "We need you, Miller. You're the only one who's been this close to him, the only one who truly understands his methods, his mindset. You put him down once. You can do it again. Put him down." The phrase grated, reducing a complex human being to an animal. But what else was he now? A terrorist leader, hell-bent on revenge. John knew the drill. The agency would want him back, fast-tracked, no questions asked about his retirement. They'd offer whatever resources he needed, a blank check for vengeance. But it wasn't vengeance he craved. It was answers, and perhaps a chance to truly finish what he thought he'd started. He remembered a conversation with his old spotter, Mac, years ago, after a particularly messy engagement. Mac had said, "Sometimes, Ghost, you just gotta pull the trigger and trust the intel. You can't carry every bullet's weight." John had tried. He'd really tried. But the weight of this one, the one that had apparently missed its mark, was crushing him. The details of the Serpent's new operations were chillingly precise. Secure communications, encrypted networks, sleeper cells embedded in major European cities. This wasn't the ragtag insurgency he'd faced in Kandahar. This was a sophisticated, well-funded global threat. The agency had pieced together fragments, whispers from the dark web, intercepted communications, but the full picture remained elusive. They needed his unique perspective, his deep, unsettling connection to the target. He was a weapon, yes, but also a key. He could feel the familiar pull, the old instincts stirring, a dangerous cocktail of dread and a perverse sense of purpose. The world outside his window, once a tranquil landscape, now seemed to pulse with an unseen threat. Every shadow held a memory, every silence, the echo of a shot fired years ago. The intel was clear, chillingly so. He was back. The ghost I'd buried. And he was coming for us all. His mind raced, replaying the original mission, searching for any anomaly, any sign he might have missed. The wind conditions, the range, the target's movements. Had there been a double? A decoy? The military's precision was often lauded, but human error, or the sheer unpredictability of combat, could always throw a wrench in the gears. He'd been trained to trust his instincts, to trust his gear, and to trust the intelligence. What happened when all three failed or were compromised? The very foundation of his identity as a sniper, as a soldier who made the hard choices, was being eroded. The phone felt heavy in his hand, a direct conduit to a past he desperately tried to outrun. He could feel the tremors starting, the familiar precursors to a full-blown flashback. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat signaling the return of the war within. He knew what would come next. The vivid images, the sounds, the smells, all assaulting his senses, blurring the lines between then and now. He braced himself, a futile gesture against the onslaught of memory. He saw Mac, his spotter, adjusting his scope, a grim determination on his face. One shot, Ghost, make it count. He saw the target, framed perfectly in the crosshairs, a moment suspended in time. The squeeze of the trigger, the recoil, the distant thud, and then the silence. A silence that had been shattered by Davy's words. He was alive. The ghost, not buried, but merely dormant, now fully awakened and seeking retribution. He looked around his cabin, at the worn leather of his armchair, the stack of books on the table, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, all symbols of a peace he'd fought for. A peace he now realized was built on a lie. The fragility of it all was sickening. He had believed he was done, that his service was complete, that he had paid his dues. But the war hadn't been done with him. It had merely retreated into the shadows, waiting for the opportune moment to strike again. And now, that moment had arrived. The phone call ended, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. John walked over to his small, locked cabinet, the one he rarely opened. He pulled out a worn wooden box. Inside lay his old service pistol, A-45, meticulously cleaned and oiled, alongside a faded photograph of his old unit. His fingers traced the cold steel of the pistol. It felt both alien and intimately familiar. He hadn't touched it in years, preferring the quiet anonymity of his civilian life. But the world outside had changed, or rather, it had revealed its true brutal face once more. He wasn't just being asked to return to duty. He was being called to confront a fundamental failure, a mistake that had festered and grown into a global threat. He had to go back. Not for the agency, not for the country, but for the ghost in the crosshairs and for the man he used to be. The man who had believed he could make a difference, even if it meant carrying the weight of a life on his conscience. He had to understand. He had to finish it, this time for good. He stared at the dossier, the weight of the rifle feeling heavier with history, colder with dread, knowing his quiet life was over and the hunt had begun anew. This wasn't just a mission. It was a reckoning. The sterile hum of the secure facility felt alien, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of his cabin. John Ghost Miller, a name he hadn't heard in years, stood before a wall of monitors, each displaying a fragment of the ghost he'd buried, now resurrected as a global threat. The faces of the analysts, young and eager, blurred into an indistinguishable mass as his gaze locked onto a grainy satellite image of a man, older now, but unmistakably him. The Kandahar ghost. The intel was overwhelming, a deluge of encrypted communications, financial transfers, and propaganda videos, all pointing to a network far more sophisticated than anything he'd encountered a decade ago. He felt the familiar weight settle on his shoulders, not just of the mission, but of a past he'd tried to outrun, a debt he had to pay. Colonel Thorne, his former handler, a man whose face was now a roadmap of old campaigns and unspoken burdens, gestured to a holographic display. His name now is Al-Hassan, operates under a dozen aliases. We've tracked his movements from the Levant to the Sahel, leaving a trail of chaos in his wake. Our intelligence suggests he's planning something big, an attack designed to cripple global infrastructure, cause mass panic. Thorne's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, the practiced tone of a man delivering grim news. John ran a hand over his jaw, the stubble rough beneath his fingers. The sterile environment, the hushed intensity of the room, it was all too familiar. The air conditioning hummed, a low thrum that vibrated in his bones, a constant reminder of the artificiality of this new world he was being pulled back into. He missed the smell of pine and damp earth, the quiet rhythm of the wilderness. He missed the illusion of peace. The psychological evaluations, a necessary evil, had been brief, clinical. A young, earnest psychologist had asked him if he felt re-traumatized by the intel. John had simply stared at her, the question hanging in the air like a bad joke. Re-traumatized? He'd never stopped being traumatized. It had just been dormant, a sleeping beast that had now been violently awoken. He felt the phantom ache of his old rifle in his hands, the familiar cold steel, the worn grip. It was a part of him, an extension of his will, And now, it seemed, it was calling him back. The first few days were a blur of briefings, equipment checks, and refamiliarization with protocols that had been etched into his muscle memory. He was assigned a new spotter, Sergeant Anya Sharma, a sharp, no-nonsense soldier with eyes that missed nothing. She was younger, a product of a different war, but her competence was undeniable. "Heard you were a legend, Ghost," she'd said, her voice devoid of reverence, just a statement of fact. "Don't disappoint." John had simply nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. Legends were just old men with heavy consciences. They spent hours in the simulation room, running through scenarios, perfecting their communication, their movements. The M24 SWS, his old companion, felt right in his hands, the familiar weight a comfort. He spent hours cleaning it, disassembling and reassembling, the rhythmic click of metal on metal, a meditative exercise. He remembered the first time he'd zeroed a rifle, the meticulous adjustments, the careful breathing. Boot camp had been a crucible, forging him into something precise, something deadly. It had taught him how to kill, but never how to live with it. As they analyzed satellite imagery of Al-Hassan's known compounds, John found himself studying the faces of the young men in the grainy photos, the same age as the one he'd shot years ago. Was Al-Hassan recruiting them with promises of glory, or was it something more insidious? He remembered a conversation with his own spotter years ago, after a particularly brutal engagement. "They're just kids, John," he'd said, his voice heavy. On both sides, the line between enemy and victim blurred, a constant torment in John's mind. He saw the cold, calculated efficiency of Al-Hassan's network, the sophisticated encryption, the compartmentalized cells. This wasn't just a ragtag group of fanatics. This was a well-oiled machine, fueled by a deep-seated hatred. The briefings detailed their modus operandi: cyber attacks, coordinated bombings, targeted assassinations. The scale of their ambition was terrifying. "He's learned," Thorne had observed, pointing to a complex network diagram. "He's adapted. He's using our own tactics against us." John felt a chill. He had taught him, in a way, through the very act of trying to eliminate him. The irony was not lost on him. During one of the mission planning sessions, a younger analyst, fresh out of some Ivy League program, droned on about predictive analytics. John tuned him out, his gaze drawn to a map of a remote, mountainous region in Eastern Europe, a potential target area. He could almost feel the biting wind, the unforgiving terrain. He remembered another mission, a cold winter night, the snow muffling all sound, the world reduced to the scope of his rifle. He'd made a difficult shot that night, one that had saved lives, but it had come at a cost. Every mission had a cost. He found himself sketching in his notebook, not targets or schematics, but the outlines of trees, the curve of a distant mountain range. It was a coping mechanism, a way to ground himself in the natural world, even when his mind was consumed by the artificial constructs of war. He thought of the quiet solitude of his cabin, the simple act of chopping wood, the smell of sawdust. It felt a lifetime away. He shared a quiet moment with Sharma during a break, both nursing lukewarm coffee. "Heard you took down a warlord in Kandahar," she said, her voice low. "That true?" John stared into his cup. "I took a shot," he replied, the words tasting like ash. "Thought it was the right one at the time." Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, met his. The right one for who? The question hung in the air, unanswered. It was a question that had haunted him for years, a question that now, with Al-Hassan's return, felt more urgent than ever. The moral ambiguity of his past actions weighed heavily, a constant companion. He remembered a priest he'd met once during a deployment who had spoken about the nature of sin and redemption. John had scoffed then, convinced that in war such concepts were luxuries. Now he wasn't so sure. Was this mission a chance for redemption, or merely a continuation of the same cycle? He didn't know. All he knew was that the world was in danger, and he was the only one who could stop it. The weight of duty pressed down, heavy and relentless. He found himself thinking about his old spotter, a man named Mac. Mac had always been the one to keep him grounded, to remind him of the human cost of their actions. Mac would have hated this, the sterile rooms, the endless data. He would have preferred the dirt, the sweat, the raw reality of the field. John missed him, missed the easy camaraderie, the unspoken understanding. He was surrounded by people, but he felt utterly alone. The target profiling continued, a meticulous dissection of Al-Hassan's psychological makeup. He was described as charismatic, intelligent, utterly ruthless, a true believer. John saw flashes of the young man he'd seen through his scope, the fire in his eyes, the conviction. It was a dangerous combination. He wondered if Al-Hassan remembered him, the ghost in the scope. Did he harbor the same burning resentment, the same desire for a reckoning? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. The first reconnaissance mission was planned for a remote outpost, a known transit point for Al-Hassan's operatives. It was a test, a way to reintegrate John into the field to see if the ghost still had what it took. Sharma would be his eyes, his ears, his anchor. He trusted her, a rare commodity in his line of work. He remembered the tension before his first real mission, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the almost unbearable anticipation. This felt different. This felt personal. This felt like a confrontation with his own past, a battle he had to win, not just for the world, but for his own fractured psyche. He saw the glint of a sniper scope in a photo of one of Al-Hassan's training camps. They were preparing. They were ready. And so, he had to be too. He spent hours on the range, his shots tight, consistent. The familiar rhythm of breath, squeeze, follow through. It was like riding a bicycle, a skill never truly forgotten, just dormant. But the targets in the range weren't faces, weren't lives. They were just paper. The reality was always different. He knew that better than anyone. The air in the transport plane was thick with the smell of aviation fuel and nervous sweat. John sat silently, his M24 cradled in his lap, the weight both comforting and ominous. Sharma checked her gear for the 10th time, her movements precise. The hum of the engines was a dull roar, a prelude to the storm. They were heading into a region known for its harsh terrain and even harsher inhabitants. This wasn't just a recon, it was a deep dive into enemy territory, a probing action to gauge Al-Hassan's strength, to find an opening. John felt the metallic tang of fear, a familiar taste, but it was mixed with something else now, a grim determination, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. This was his burden, his fight. He had to finish what he started, one way or another. He closed his eyes, picturing the target, the face from the intel reports, then the younger face from his memory. He had to separate them, had to see the threat, not the ghost. But the two were intertwined, inextricably linked in the labyrinth of his mind. He adjusted the sling on his rifle, the worn leather a familiar touch. The world outside the plane's small window was a blur of darkness, a vast, indifferent canvas. He was a small, insignificant dot moving across it, carrying the weight of a world he was trying to save, and a past he was trying to reconcile. The drop was smooth, the silence after the ramp closed almost deafening. They moved through the moonless night, the only sounds the crunch of their boots on loose gravel and the whisper of the wind. John led the way, his senses heightened, every shadow a potential threat, every rustle of leaves a warning. Sharma moved like a shadow behind him, her night vision goggles giving her an otherworldly appearance. They reached their observation point, a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley, where Al-Hassan's operatives were reportedly consolidating. John set up his rifle, the familiar motions almost automatic. The world narrowed to the scope, a tunnel vision of purpose. He scanned the valley, the thermal imaging revealing heat signatures moving within the compound. He saw the sentries, the patrol routes, the faint glow of fires. He saw the enemy, and in the back of his mind, he saw the ghost. The mission was underway. The reckoning had truly begun. As they moved into position, the metallic tang of fear mixed with the stale coffee, a familiar morning ritual before the storm, before the choice that would define him. The wind picked up, a cold, biting whisper carrying the scent of dust and distant smoke. John settled in, his body a part of the earth, his mind a whirlwind of past and present. The long night stretched before them, a canvas upon which their fate would be painted. The world saw a terrorist. I saw the face of a man I'd once believed I'd saved it from. The wind, a constant abrasive whisper, carried the scent of dust and distant diesel. It was a familiar symphony, one that had played countless times in my life, each note a prelude to the silence that followed the shot. Tonight, it felt different. He was here, somewhere in the labyrinth of crumbling concrete and makeshift shelters, A ghost brought back to life by my own hand. The intel had been precise, almost brutally so. He was planning something big, something that would dwarf his previous atrocities, a global strike that would make Kandahar look like a skirmish. And I was the only one close enough, the only one who truly understood the twisted logic behind his ambition. My rifle, the same one that had ended his first life, felt like an extension of my own scarred psyche, heavy with history, cold with dread. This wasn't just a mission, it was a reckoning, a final, brutal accounting for a debt I thought I'd already paid. We had moved into position under the cloak of a moonless night, the urban sprawl a patchwork of shadows and dim, flickering lights. My spotter, a young Marine named Rodriguez, was a quiet professional, his breathing steady beside me. He didn't know the full story, not the personal one. He knew the intel, the target's current designation, the threat matrix. He knew his job, and he did it well. We were nestled in the skeletal remains of what was once a textile factory, overlooking the compound where our target, now known by his new moniker, the Architect, was believed to be holed up. The air was thick with the metallic tang of fear, a familiar taste that mixed with the stale coffee from my thermos. It was a morning ritual before the storm, before the choice that would define me, define us all. The drone feed hummed softly in Rodriguez's ear, a distant mechanical insect. Our comms were open, a low murmur of tactical updates, a symphony of control chaos. Every shadow held a potential threat. Every silence, the echo of a shot fired years ago. My scope, a familiar window to a world of violence, was already scanning, sweeping, searching. The target was a master of evasion, a ghost among ghosts. But I knew him. I knew the way he moved, the way he thought, the way he breathed. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the shifting patterns of light and shadow, and the occasional tremor of distant gunfire, a constant reminder of the chaos simmering just beneath the surface of this city. My mind drifted, not to the past kill, not yet, but to the training, the endless repetition of breath control, triggered discipline. Boot camp taught us to kill. It never taught us how to live with it, how to carry the weight of a life extinguished. Rodriguez, sensing my focus waver, offered a quiet, almost imperceptible nod. He understood. He'd seen enough to know that the hardest part wasn't pulling the trigger, but living with the echo. Our intel had pinpointed a specific window, a fleeting opportunity when the Architect was expected to cross an exposed courtyard. The wind, a fickle beast, was picking up, gusting erratically. I adjusted for it, the subtle clicks of the scope almost meditative. I remembered a similar wind in Kandahar, a crosswind that had almost thrown my shot. Almost. The memory was a shard of glass, sharp and cold. I ran through the ballistics in my head, the range, the altitude, the temperature, every variable accounted for, every contingency planned. This wasn't just about taking a shot. It was about orchestrating a precise, surgical strike in a chaotic environment. The radio crackled, a terse update from command. Target moving, ETA 2 mics. My heart rate, which I had meticulously controlled for hours, began to climb. The familiar adrenaline surged, not a rush, but a cold, calculated readiness. I took a deep, measured breath, exhaled slowly, and settled into the rifle. The world narrowed to the crosshairs. My vision sharpened, every detail of the compound below coming into stark, terrifying relief. A flicker of movement. There. A figure, flanked by 2 heavily armed guards, emerged from a doorway. He was older now, a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, a cruel smirk playing on his lips even from this distance. It was him, the Kandahar ghost. My ghost. I saw the younger version of him, the fear in his eyes just before the shot, superimposed over the hardened terrorist I now faced. It was a brief, almost hallucinatory moment, a collision of past and present. Rodriguez, calm and steady, called out the range, the wind. 200 meters, wind 10 knots, left to right. His voice was a lifeline, anchoring me to the present. I made the final adjustments, the rifle becoming an extension of my will. This wasn't just another target. This was the one that had haunted my sleep, the one that had twisted my sense of purpose. This was the one that had forced me to question everything. The world saw a terrorist. I saw the face of a man I'd once believed I'd saved it from, a man who had returned to prove me wrong, to prove that some ghosts never truly die. The choice was clear. yet the weight of it pressed down on me, heavier than any rifle. Follow orders, eliminate the threat, or let the past dictate the present. There was no room for sentiment, not here, not now. But the image of his face, younger, more vulnerable, flickered again. Was this justice? Or merely the continuation of a cycle I had helped set in motion? The thought was a poison, seeping into the edges of my focus. I pushed it down, deep where it belonged. Duty. That was the only word that mattered. The target moved into the open, a brief, clear shot. My finger found the trigger, the familiar cold metal against my skin. Breathe, squeeze. The principles were etched into my very being. The world held its breath. I held mine. The shot. It was clean, precise, just as it had been years ago. The figure crumpled, his guards scattering in a frantic, confused panic. The sound of the shot, amplified by the confined space of our hide, echoed, then faded into the distant din of the city. Rodriguez confirmed the kill, his voice flat, professional. Target down, confirmed. But the confirmation brought no relief, no sense of closure, only a profound, aching emptiness. The shot cracked, a sharp, violent punctuation mark in the otherwise muffled symphony of the night. The architect, mid-stride, stumbled, then collapsed, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. His guards, momentarily stunned, reacted with a frantic, uncoordinated burst of gunfire, spraying rounds into the surrounding rubble. Rodriguez, without a word, began packing up, his movements efficient, practiced. My scope remained fixed on the fallen figure, searching for any sign of life, any twitch, any last defiant breath. There was none. He was gone, again. But this time, the finality felt different. There was no doubt, no lingering question. The mission was complete. The threat neutralized. Yet, the victory felt hollow, a bitter taste in my mouth. The image of the younger man, the one I had first targeted, flashed in my mind, then dissolved, replaced by the hardened, vengeful face of the architect. Had I truly saved anyone, or merely delayed the inevitable? Had my first shot, years ago, merely set him on a darker path, forged him into this monster? The question swirled, a relentless tide of self-doubt. Ghost, we need to move. Rodriguez's voice cut through the haze, calm and urgent. I pulled back from the scope, the world expanding, the sounds of distant sirens growing louder. The extraction team would be here soon. Our job was done, but the reckoning, the true accounting, felt like it had only just begun. The silence that followed the last shot was not peace, but a heavier quiet, a testament to the enduring cost of war and the quiet heroism of those who carry its scars. We moved through the ruins, a practiced dance of stealth and evasion, leaving no trace. The adrenaline slowly receded, replaced by a profound weariness that settled deep in my bones. I had done my duty. I had prevented a catastrophic attack, but the cost, the personal cost, remained immeasurable. The cycle of violence, it seemed, was endless, and I was merely a cog in its brutal machinery. The faces of the fallen, both friend and foe, blurred into a single, haunting mosaic in my memory. The architect, once a ghost, now truly gone. But the ghost of Kandahar, the younger man, would forever remain a permanent resident in the landscape of my fractured psyche. There was no triumph, no celebration, only the quiet certainty that some battles, the ones fought within, never truly end. We reached the rendezvous point, the dark silhouette of the extraction vehicle a welcome sight. As I climbed in, the weight of the rifle felt lighter, almost insignificant, compared to the burden of my memories. The world outside would continue its chaotic spin, oblivious to the silent battles fought in its shadows. And I, John Miller, the ghost, would continue to carry the scars, a quiet hero in a world that rarely understood the true price of peace. The engine rumbled to life, carrying us away from the ruins, away from the immediate aftermath. But the journey inward, the one I had been on for years, was far from over. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the vehicle and the distant cries of a city slowly waking to a new, precarious dawn. I knew I would sleep, eventually, but the dreams, I suspected, would be waiting. Thank you for listening to the story to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. See you soon.